Hello and welcome to this week's Talking Africa podcast, where we get behind the news from the continent. I'm Anne-Marie Besada. Our weekly podcast is brought to you by the Africa Report magazine, which you can always check out online at theafricareport.com. Now, in this week's episode, we'll be visiting a dark moment in the history of Niger. A moment that few talk about, yet alone know about. Known as the Voulet-Chanoine mission, it was led by French Captain Paul Voulet in 1898. In just a few months, he spearheaded a campaign of terror as he made his way towards Lake Chad in an effort to unite all of France's territories in West Africa. Nearly a year later, the expedition ended, but the damage was done, and the scars are still felt to this day. In a feature-length documentary called African Apocalypse, Femi, Nyader and Lemkin retrace the path of Voulet and meet the people who still share the stories of their families who survived the campaign. I began by asking them why dig up old skeletons now? Why not leave bad memories in the past? Femi is the first to respond.
Well, I mean, I think it's never been revealed before, right? It's not like old news as though something which is being kind of spoken about and which is a known history and which is well documented. This is something which the French actively tried to bury at the time, which they actively tried to avoid at the time, actively tried to kind of denounce and say was just the kind of the excesses of one man who went a bit crazy in the desert, and we don't need to actually investigate it or document it and the rest. But for the people there, it's still as real today as it was when it happened. And I think these histories, which are often we don't just get accused of dragging out like old history that doesn't need to be spoken about anymore, and it's kind of like, why are we still looking at things in the past which aren't actually that long ago, but also kind of this idea that people who look at these things are rewriting history and changing the established history of empires, whether that's the French Empire or the British Empire or the German Empire, as civilizing missions and the rest. The reality is that this investigative work which needs to be done to tell the story properly for the first time.
Rob,
I think I'd also add that I'll just add to what Femi was saying, which is that as France is experiencing at the moment, still the opening up of what happened in the Algerian War, which was a far more high profile event and kind of target of French imperial activity over, not just in the 50s and early 60s, but going back to the 19th century. Even that is now being opened up in new ways, because I think, in a way, all of this kind of imperial activity, colonial activity, has left too many questions unresolved, which kind of lie under the surface of today's situation. And I think when it comes to a place like Niger, it's a country that even in France is not really kind of known about. I mean, Femi's from Nigeria. The Hausa people were divided by two into the northern parts into Niger, the southern group of the people living in Nigeria. Niger is not known well here in this country either. It's typical of a lot of different places, I think, where the colonial moment, the moment of colonial kind of conquest was very violent. And that kind of moment of what you might call dispossession. I think Thomas Piketty actually has written about it. I'm just reading his book, what's it called? Capitalism and Ideology, or Capital and Ideology. It's a very big point, which is that this changing of the control of these places, was usually kind of involved a huge amount of violence. In the case of Niger, as Femi says, the story has not really been told. I mean, the story has been told. There have been films about it. There have been books about it. But actually, Nigerian people haven't told the story. The story has been told through some French journalists and historians writing from written records, but the actual oral testimony. I mean, sadly, I think the oral testimony could have been gathered in a more intense way earlier at the time, but closer to the time. But the fact that even 120 years later, young children, schoolgirls of about 14 and 15, are still feeling upset, as they do feel in our film, as they talk about it, not because they have just learned about it in school and they're kind of connecting with it, but actually because it's been part of their family history for a long time. They're talking about what their grandmother told them about what she heard from her mother. And so this is a very deep history, which still hasn't been acknowledged. And I think at the moment, I suppose Niger is typical of a place in Africa, not just Africa, maybe Asia and other places as well, but typical. The population there feels that there needs to be, firstly, an acknowledgement and a recognition of what happened, and then moving step by step towards some kind of better situation.
I'll get to actually the French reaction later on, but in the documentary, we do see how the Nigerians themselves they seemed very forthcoming and wanting to share the stories and the anecdotes that they've heard growing up, that they've heard from other family members. Were they really that open to talking to you, given that it's a European, theoretically, a crew coming to film them and you have cameras and everything? Were they okay with that?
I mean, we went there the crew went there 3 times. I mean, Femi and I filmed the 3rd time, but I'd gone there a first time and then a second time just before actually filming. And we worked very closely in every single community with, and we had to do this, with the local authorities, whether they be traditional authorities or whether they be the actual kind of formal regional government, because as you know, it's a very unstable place, Niger. There's a lot of kidnapping. There's a lot of terrorist attacks. Huge 100 or so people were killed just last month in Niger, just north of the capital. So you have to be very careful when you're going there. We worked with people who were both from the government, but also in the sort of cinema community and the film community of Niger, of which there is quite a sort of very exciting and intense kind of a group of people that are making films. And so we worked with those people, and I think we can't. I'm sorry. I'm going to have to switch my phone off. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Sorry about that.
But yeah, I mean, while he's gone, I'll just chip in. It was, I think the people, firstly, there was this kind of middle ground. Of course, it was a white film crew, but it wasn't just a white film crew. Our our sound director was Nigerian himself. Obviously, and one of the things we explore in the film itself is my relationship between being someone who grew up in Europe and someone of African descent, and also how the Nigerians themselves respond to that. And there is the sentence that the soldiers, even though I was Black, they sometimes the chief of the soldiers saw me as a European and a white man in terms of how I thought about things and digested things. And so that clash was always there. But I feel as though, as Rob said, the relationship was nurtured over many years on his side, and the way we went in from a perspective of humility and a perspective of listening to them and trying to tell their story, rather than a perspective of, cool, this is what we want from you. I feel as though the people, because were willing to open up and share their stories. And as we mentioned in our recent Guardian article, the head of Voulet-Chanoine actually cancelled his own trip to Mecca for the Hajj in order to receive us, in order to tell this story, because it was so important for them to get it out, as it were.
He's actually he's actually a really good example, the Sultan of Voulet-Chanoine, because when I went there in 2015, he himself, the Sultan, wasn't that interested in Voulet. He said, "Oh, you'll have to talk to my brother about that. I don't really know too much about it. It's a long time ago." Kind of that attitude that you are just talking about, Anne-Marie, like, well, are people are they so concerned with this as they appear to be in this film? And then when we went back in 2018 and then early 2019 to film, sadly, the Sultan's brother had died. But the Sultan himself had become now extremely interested. This was even before us knowing that we were going to be actually filming at this point, had become extremely interested in the story of Voulet and the battles with his great-grandfather, and how the town had been ransacked and the various negotiations that had gone on, of which you just see a bit of. So I think it's one of those things where, for a period in time, there was this feeling that, oh yeah, certain people are kind of keeping the flame of history alive, but it's not really something that's really exciting everybody. But I think now, and our film was made before all of this upsurge in Black Lives Matter and this kind of global protest. Our film was shot before that. Obviously, we edited it and finished it as that was happening. But I think the fact that that is happening is actually part of a general feeling of there's a deeper connection with the sort of the unresolved things of colonial history than there was 20 or 30 years ago, when probably there were more people alive who were more maybe interested in talking about the details of the history, how things had happened. Now it's more a question of thinking about it in terms of, well, is it right that it happened? Why did it happen, and what can we do about the fact that it happened? So there's a bit of a change of consciousness, and I think many people feel that in Niger. It'll be interesting to see as and when we're able to sort of take the film to Niger to see how people respond to it. Certainly the Nigerian people who've seen it, people who were involved in the film, who've seen a version of it, have been very affected by it and feel that it's like a lot of films. When you start compressing stories, it all seems very intense. Of course, when it's just spread out and you talk about it amongst other things and you learn about other things, then it fits into a kind of a bigger pattern. But I think obviously that's the job of films usually, is to try to really intensify and concentrate that kind of interest. So we'll see how people respond when we go there later in the year, assuming that the security conditions are such that we can.
Just talking about that compressing in the documentary and in a film of all the different stories into one. While you were there speaking to everybody, spending time, of course, you have, I'm sure, many more stories to tell that couldn't all be put in there. But what visible scars can you see from that experience from 120 years ago that are still quite alive today, apart from the stories, but just from what you were seeing and the interaction of people with you amongst each other? Was there anything that you could put your hand on?
I mean, it's the reality of Niger today, right? Is a scar. It's something which has been left from that time. The ranking in the UN Development Index of Niger as bottom last. The continued dependence on, or even kind of the continued tying to a currency which is printed in France and which is controlled by Paris, the CFA, the fact that we'd be planning to meet someone to do an interview, and the interview will be cancelled because one of their immediate family had died of a preventable disease that they couldn't get medicine for, and so we'd have to reschedule and do something else. All of these realities, and the realities you see at the grave, where they're saying our children leave to go off to Libya or this, that, or the other place, and they never come back sometimes, are scars of the colonial period. They're living real modern day effects of the fact that this land was taken by force and continued to, even after Voulet did his initial massacre, even after Club came along and supposedly came and saved the day by by taking the mission away from this person. He himself, of course, well, we don't want to give too many spoilers, but the French continued after Voulet ended up not completing his side of the mission to still take the land. They continued to rule over the land for decades and decades after, and even after so-called independence, they continued to enjoy the resources, the uranium of Niger, until today, and to help in the help towards the impoverishing of the country. So I think that throughout the film, all of the poverty and all of the modern day things you see, the fact that there's a lack of energy, a lack of electricity, even though Niger is providing France with uranium, which provides up to a third or possibly more of its electrical needs. All of these things are scars of colonialism, and that's one of the main things we want to drive home in the film, that colonialism isn't just a thing in the past, and it isn't just, as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, something you can leave behind and say, well, it's history. It is today, it is the present, it is what shaped our modern world, it's what shaped the lived realities of people in countries like England and France, and it's what's shaped the lived realities of people in countries like Niger and Uganda and Kenya and India and the rest of the formerly colonized states.
So, there was one story, Anne-Marie, that I wanted to mention when you said this is perhaps a little bit more narrow than what Femi was just talking about, but you mentioned what scars do you see today, and you're talking about film stories that we couldn't include in the film. And there was this quite amazing story that we didn't include in the film, which is that there is a village somewhere about maybe halfway across Niger, where the women have scars on their face, just scar markings that are made as part of the kind of cultural practices of the community. And it's not that far from the main road, the road that was Voulet's trail of massacre and the road that we followed. It's not that far from the road, but it's a kind of like a community that's quite sealed off, because no one else around there does this kind of practice of making scars on the face. No other communities, no other societies. They're Hausa people, but they don't do it there. And it turned out that this wasn't our discovery. This was a Nigerian, an older man who was he was a health administrator in the local department, the local government. Some years ago, he wondered what all of this was about, and he realized that through the material that he read and putting two and two together, he realized that these were women, not these women, but these women were the children and grandchildren of women who had been kidnapped by Voulet, because as we have in our film, there's a woman who's kidnapped and taken across the country by him. And there were hundreds of people like this who were, in fact, because Voulet's convoy consisted of thousands, a couple of thousand of people, but the turnover of people was so high that actually the number of thousands of people that it was churning through was very, very intense during this maybe 7 or 8 month period in which he was making his way across what is now Niger. And so these women had been kidnapped, in a place that maybe wasn't so far away from the capital, from Niamey, and had then been taken, effectively transported along with this invading convoy, 500-600 miles across 500 or 600 kilometers across the country. And then when the mission was over, or kind of put into a pause because Voulet had been kind of relieved of his command, shall we say, they were just left there, and they were just sort of really. In fact, I think even as I recall, some of the kind of written records, there's a note that actually Voulet at one point decided to release all the prisoners. Here they are, they can just go, because he knew that he was going to be possibly killed by the people that had come from France to get him. So these women have lived in that, and this community has lived kind of slightly sealed off from the rest of the people around it, and they have this particular kind of practice which was regarded as strange by the people who lived nearby. And then when they put it together, they realized that actually, well, it was from this colonial invasion, and they had been transported not that far, 600 or 700 miles, maybe 1,000 kilometers, but far enough for it to be a very unusual practice of marking on the face. So this was a really strange particular thing. I just want to add one other thing, and this is, I think, maybe one of the most moving things that I wish that we'd been able to put into our film, but we were slightly tied into a whole concept of chronology and time of it, is that the elderly men who talk about the sacking of Bernin Koni towards the end of our film, they also were put, like many people in Niger, were put to work in a kind of forced labor, a corvée of sorts, to build the road. So that road then became a formal builded road, and that kind of la corvée, the forced labor, actually continued from 1899, 1900, all the way up to just on the eve of the Second World War. And even the people that we were meeting, who were mostly doing their corvée or their labor just in the 50s or maybe late 40s into just on the eve of independence, there was still effectively a kind of shall we say, it was the labor was coerced, shall we say, and they felt that very, very strongly, and it was something that they really did feel very that was a kind of was the lingering effect of the aftermath of the horror stories that they'd heard from their own parents and their grandparents, was this feeling that actually, and they were still having to be put to work to maintain this road and to keep it going, because of course it's the main road that goes across the country, and it more or less divides the two countries, Niger and Nigeria.
Yeah, it's quite intense, those stories. Just kind of building a little bit on the subject of scars, you mentioned at the beginning of the film and also in your article that at the time this was taking place, we had sort of similar situations going on across the continent. We had in Sudan, we had in Congo, Nigeria, pretty much, everywhere where there was colonial presence, something was going on. And Femi, perhaps this question is more for you, but as a first generation born outside of Nigeria, do you think that kind of healing can take place for the local populations years afterwards, 50 years, 100 years? I mean, can we say we can always live with Europeans? There's none of this, we don't always have a flashback to what if or what could, that in time that kind of, it will sort of equalize out of it, balance out of it? Or is that something that's part of the DNA of people in a way, because of it's quite, it didn't take place that long ago. It's still
I think that when we have discussions about kind of forgiveness, and we have discussions about kind of moving on, I always think of an African kind of proverb which says, and I always think of it and then forget it and have to remember what it says, but it says something like, the antelope cannot begin to heal until it's out of the lion's mouth. And I add to that and say the lion cannot begin to apologize until its mouth is off the antelope's leg. So at the end of the day, whilst Europe is still continuing to exploit that and still continuing to benefit from these colonial relationships, whether that is based on monetary things such as the CFA, or such as the structural adjustment arrangements with the IMF and the World Bank between many supposedly developed and supposedly developing nations, whether that's based on resource extraction, whether that's based on all of the elements of neo-colonialism which we see in the world today, right? We cannot begin to even have the conversation of forgiveness and moving on and these things which are often asked to people from places like Niger, right? We have these questions, and the questions they even come up in our film, right? We have people saying, Amina translates "Bamu Yahiba" to "Pardon pas." We will not forgive. We won't forgive this thing that happens in the first village we come to, and then later on we see with the schoolgirls the same question come up, and question of whether reparations is possible, and the teacher says even if they can pay money, they can never pay for the lives taken, they can never pay for the lives lost, they can never pay for the women violated, they can never pay. And the teacher lists off all of these atrocities. And I think this is key, right? In order to make these steps towards kind of repentance and fixing the situation, and all living together in harmony and peace, and saying this is in the past, we need to first make the step towards changing the current situation. And at the moment, the current situation is a continuation of the same colonial relationships which existed during the colonial period. And so I think, would I say it's impossible? No. But would I say there's a long way to go before kind of some reconciliation? For sure.
Do you both think that just from the experiences that you've had, and like you said, this ended, you finished editing just right when the Black Lives Matter round 2 was starting to take off, and you saw there was a destruction of a lot of those statues that represented those, destructive figures of the past. I think just recently Lloyd's of London announced it will seek an archivist to explain its link to slavery. We also have Emmanuel Macron, who said he had hired Benjamin Starr to kind of explain the links of what had happened to Algeria under colonial rule. Is that enough? When is it enough? We can do documentary after documentary. We have international this day, international that day, but when is it enough?
I think, I think the recognition of what was done has to be full, and for it to find the next step. Yeah, because I think there's too much. I think there's probably too much of a sense of, there were some bad things that happened, but look at the progress and development that we made. We wouldn't have made that without that. We don't know. I think that's the thing that certainly many people in Niger, and I've made films in lots of different countries around the world, and have come across this kind of attitude again before. But many people in Niger, I think, feel like that their possibilities for development were really totally stymied and sort of stillborn by not just the violence of the encounter in the case of Voulet and Niger, but also the fact that so many people had been scattered, so that because the number of people killed, and then you have a number of people who are all sort of fled and have now kind of hiding in various kind of places, and the possibility of towns and cities kind of reforming and then reforming their own infrastructure and getting kind of their own form of development is difficult. So I think that's the real. I think the bottom line is that sort of saying sorry unfortunately is probably just the beginning. I don't think it's going to be enough, because I think saying sorry is really just the starting point for trying to work out not just that you're going to be sorry, or not just that the forces and the powers and the states that we're talking about are sorry for incidents of violence and atrocity, but the depth of the feeling about those events is because of those events still control a sense of injustice that permeates today. We don't here in England think, people should apologize for the civil war in the 17th century, because nothing really, although our lives are totally affected by it, it hasn't led to one group of people feeling that they have done well out of it and they are lucky and privileged and everything's going well, and another group of people thinking, well, there's nothing left for us, we just have to sort of make the most of not very much resources. It hasn't, but the history of colonial history, and I think it reaches forward through to, and in the case of Algeria, of course, it reaches forward to quite close living memory. I think in Niger, perhaps, not so much in terms of direct violence, but if you take the testimony of those men who were mining uranium until very recently for the parastatal company that still is in Niger. I mean, it's changed its name and it's changed its structure, but there's still a lot of uranium mining in Niger. Those people working unprotected, working in conditions that they weren't really fully informed about, that wouldn't have happened in France. And they know that, and they also know that, the French farmers who lost their land in northern France in order that the nuclear reactors could be built were very heavily compensated, whereas the Nigerian workers who were became ill as a result of not working in good protected conditions have not really been compensated in ways that they have been happy with. Obviously, we have to be careful here because it's a lot of legal issues, but by and large, those legal cases have not really been able to go forward. And so the sense of injustice and the ability of the French parastatal to extract that uranium out of the ground derives from a national security agreement that Niger had with France, with Paris, with Niamey government had with Paris, that had to sign that in 1960. If it didn't, but I think it signed it in 1961. But if it hadn't signed it, or said it was going to sign it, it wouldn't have got independence. And that wasn't true. That's not just true for Niger. That was true for Gabon, Cameroon, all French African states. And I suspect, I don't know about Britain, but it may well have been the same in Britain. But certainly for France, it was explicit. They had to sign these arrangements so that, they put the resources of the country at the service of the French, the colonial powers' national security interests. So the long arm of this colonial movement that starts with obviously a violent force coming to a place and deciding to take it over reaches all the way up to the present. So the apology, like we say, I think that the first thing is to recognize what happened, which is why in these situations, truth and reconciliation commissions, or shall we say truth commissions, are very important, because I think reconciliation can only come along with a concept of justice and what would happen. So to that extent, I think, as we say in our recent article, the fact that Macron is looking to start a commission of some sort is to be welcomed, but to be pushed an awful lot further. I mean, we don't have such a commission here in terms of British activities, imperial activities. So, it's a step on from that, but it's no means by no means enough to say we're only going to look at Algeria.
Yeah, and it's definitely a step on. But again, in the recent commission, they commissioned a French historian rather than an Algerian historian. And that historian, I think, mentions war crimes and crimes against humanity in his report negligibly, and only mentions them to reference Macron mentioning them in a way that he then retracted once he got backlash from the right in France. So if the commission is to have any standing, they need to properly, the acknowledgement, as Rob says, is the first step, and the acknowledgement of Algeria is a first step towards an acknowledgement of a much wider French project, which goes beyond Algeria, which goes to Niger, which goes to Indochina, which goes very, very far. I mean, France held a huge empire which had a lot of atrocities throughout, and acknowledgement without action becomes symbolism, in the same way that in the UK we have this kind of clap for nurses thing, and everyone's clapping, but they're not funding the NHS, they're not doing the actual realities of what the clapping should necessarily move on and entail. Cool, great, we've acknowledged something bad happened. Now, where does the actual reparatory justice come in? Because if I slap you in the face and then I say sorry, but I don't do anything to help your pain, then your cheek is still stinging, right? So I think that, yeah, the first step is the recognition, and it seems that difficult even to get that, and hopefully things like this film will begin to be a first step towards recognition. It'll be very interesting to see how the film, once we manage to get it out in France, will be received in France as opposed to the UK, right? Because in the UK, it's kind of a story about European colonial history, but the specifics are not as accusatory towards the UK example, because then we're not training a British officer, right? Whereas in France, it's much more personal and close to home and accusatory. This is what you did, this is what your country did, this is what built your nation. And so I'm very, very intrigued to see how the reception will be there.
So to date, there hasn't been any reaction from the French side, I'm assuming, just because it hasn't yet been picked up here. Okay.
No.
Yeah.
Okay, that will be quite interesting. I was curious about the narrative that you chose to tell it all through the, finding your Kurtz from the Heart of Darkness, kind of retracing who is the real one. Do you think, how am I going to wear this? Does that sort of alienate a bit of the African audience? Because that is not perhaps a book that a lot of people might want, even in European or American school systems. It's not necessarily something that people know about or have read. They may have heard Apocalypse Now and they can kind of put two and two together. But to use that narrative, it's very strong if you know it. But if you don't know it, well, that could distance people away from the very point you're trying to make.
I hope that it doesn't. I mean, I agree. I do agree. I think that's a big risk. And I think when you're talking about audiences in, for example, in West Africa, it may well be that a slightly different version of the film would be shown. I mean, I know that the Hausa people that have seen it here in the UK, they relate particularly to the Hausa testimony that's told in the film. That's really all that matters to them. They're not, they're not concerned with Heart of Darkness or Mr. Kurtz, and they're not concerned with Femi's story. They're just concerned with what happened to the Hausa people in Niger, and that is, I think, because there's a large amount of material that was shot that wasn't included in the film. I think we will. In the due course, obviously, there will need to be some kind of making available, some kind of archive of stuff that can be used by people in a much more direct kind of way, where they don't need to be concerned. But I suppose there are two things. I mean, one is that the film had quite a long gestation, and it was trying to be being made. We were trying to make it for some years, and the compelling sort of place that Heart of Darkness has in the kind of canon of imperial literature and our kind of cultural storytelling, like Apocalypse Now, as you mentioned, Anne-Marie, is so strong that actually, for a time when we were trying to get the film going and off the ground, it really helped us to sort of be able to sort of make this point that colonialism hadn't really been looked at in this kind of very universal kind of way, because I think we don't really consider it as being like, oh, it's a film about Heart of Darkness. It's really a film about white supremacy and what one white supremacist did in Niger, and a kind of a huge account of what it's like to live with that, what the legacy of that white supremacist. But because the white supremacist, meaning Voulet and the French officers, is kind of only lives in the fragments of documentation. Of course, Heart of Darkness is a richer text, which kind of helps us to be able to say that actually, these white supremacists, I mean, obviously many people would say they still exist today, and they were until recently in the White House. But I mean, that there are the white supremacist, kind of archetypal white supremacist is what we're trying to get at. So we're not interested in Apocalypse, Heart of Darkness or Joseph Conrad for the sake of it. And I would also add to that, which is that, and I don't know, because the film hasn't been seen yet by enough people, because it's just been on a kind of virtual cinema release. So it's, we're talking about a low number of thousands of people that have seen it. But I think that people who don't really necessarily know anything about Heart of Darkness or Joseph Conrad still kind of understand the story. That Femi is interested in this book. The book is very powerful. And then, when you hear the story of this book, which is very emotional, very subjective about how do things appear and how do things feel in this very strong kind of way, the story becomes more vivid in a kind of a way. So I hope that, even for people who don't know Art of Darkness and feel that rather than feeling turned off by it or alienated, that they would still feel able to be drawn in by, and maybe that they would then think, oh, maybe I'll read Art of Darkness. I'll just say one other thing before, I'm sure Femi may want to say something, but say one other thing, which is I think a lot of people feel quite rightly, they feel very hostile to Joseph Conrad and Heart of Darkness, and they see it as a kind of there's a Nigerian writer, Chinua Achebe, who wrote a very famous lecture and then an academic paper in which he called Conrad a bloody racist, and that's kind of set in train a whole kind of strong line of thinking and critical thinking about this piece of literary fiction, to say that actually it shouldn't be given the kind of canonical status that it has. It's one of the most talked about literary books of pieces of writing in modern literature, taught in all American and British universities. But just it's kind of important maybe for us to remember that in this film we were not really engaging with really the authority of Conrad, or even what the kind of cultural context of Conrad particularly was, so much as using the text in order to, like I say, try and get closer to understanding, or not even understanding, but to grasping some kind of sense of what this white supremacist mindset is. So that when in Niger, where you see the kind of the results of that mindset are etched onto people's memories and people's lives and people's even surroundings, then it all becomes much more forceful.
Femi, I don't know if you
yeah,
want
indeed.
to
The Heart of Darkness as a text is somewhat controversial. It is well read by people in academic circles, but often, we use the text somewhat in the film. We have segments of the text which kind of, I think, elucidate and show the parallels between Conrad and Voulet, right? Because as Voulet is doing something, we'll have a part of the text which is supposedly talking about Kurtz, and it will seem as though it's describing what Voulet is doing at the time. So I think that's how we drew out the connection between the two. But I definitely think that we did something in the text that separates us from Conrad's Heart of Darkness. For those who have read it and who do know the controversies in the Heart of Darkness, the main controversy is that it's written from the perspective of the European, and the African barely gets to speak, which is something we even recognize in the film. In Conrad's novel, the African barely gets to speak, apart from a few moments where he says, like, Mr. Kurtz, he dead, and a few other bits. Whereas in ours, what we tried to do is we tried to give the people of Niger the voice, right? Even myself as the narrator, someone who is a diasporic, someone from the diaspora, who is kind of in this identity between African and European. It's not centering the narrator, it's trying to center the voices of the people of Niger and allow them to really tell their story. And I think that's what separates us from the novel that Conrad gives of this Marlowe character traveling across the Congo River. Everything is from his perspective. He sees the Africans as kind of characters, but everything is from his perspective. And I'm traveling along this route that Voulet traveled. But the meat of the film, as Rob has rightly pointed out, and as Rob mentioned, the people of Niger are really interested in hearing, is a direct testimony of the people as to what happened and their perspectives.
Okay. No,
it's kind of like a post-colonial retelling of Heart of Darkness, or even maybe a decolonial retelling of Heart of Darkness.
Mm-hmm. No, it works. I was just in my mind. If you hadn't read it, it's not like a Shakespeare reference where you can kind of figure it out. It's a very dark piece of literature,
and it's complicated. And I also should say one other thing, just whether it's of interest to your audience, but just that I think the emphasis on Conrad was not something that we originally had planned to do quite as much as we did. But the fact is that the funding for this film, which was not a particularly cheap film to make, so a lot of the funding for this film came from BBC and it came from the BBC Arts Department. So the film was made with an important kind of a it was important that it was tethered to this literary piece of literature.
A literary vehicle.
Yeah.
I think we might have to wrap it up, but I didn't know if either of you had some final thoughts to share or sort of little conclusion to add to it. Rob, you're nodding your head, so I'll let you go.
I really hope that people get to see the film, and when they see it, that it kind of becomes a sort of a jumping off point for thinking about the way all these issues and ideas connect at all these different levels, and that they don't necessarily think about it as in terms of, oh, this is the specifics of what happened in Niger, as if Niger was on its own in this experience, but they sort of see it as a kind of universal tale of what it is that what is that kind of what is that totally unhealed wound that is still gaping open and is still causing a big problem, not just across the world, not just in Africa. And ultimately, it's kind of a film about how did the glaring kind of issues of inequality, global inequality that we're talking about in the world now, and there are such problems, how did those kind of start to get created? And I think hopefully this film is a kind of, shall we say, a compelling and dramatic way of kind of getting your imagination to engage with those ideas.
Yeah, to add to that, this is one story of many, many, many stories. And as you've already mentioned, Anne-Marie, we talked about how in the same time we had the same stuff going on in Sudan, in Namibia, etc. But in terms of my own personal kind of career in film, and in terms of just if other people want to make films, and if this can be funded and supported in some way, I'm hoping that this becomes part of a unraveling of all these stories, and that we continue to look at what happened with the Mau Mau in Kenya, or the Herero massacre in Namibia, or in the Algerian War itself, and we continue to interrogate the history of European colonialism in Africa and beyond, because Voulet isn't just one individual. He was. It's not something we address in the film, but the French already knew to some extent. He'd already done some stuff in Burkina Faso. He was a tool of the French, and his violence was a tool of the French, and it was part of the wider tool of the French and of any colonial power, which is violence, which uses violence to dominate and to take away land and resources. And I think that this is something which needs to be continually interrogated, a story which needs to be continually told, and which is really the story of our modern world. And we can only begin a process of healing once we understand this. And for me, film is a great medium to do it through, because it's a medium which is accessible, right? We can all read reports and books, but how many people are really going to read the story report at the end of the day? If the story report brings something out, and then people talk more about the Algerian war, and even a film like the Battle of Algiers, it was censored in France because people knew how powerful a tool it was in terms of telling the story, the true story of the Algerian resistance. And it was many years before it was allowed to be shown in France. And so I'm hoping that this is part of what will be a wider movement in film to continue to tell these stories.
And that's about all the time we have for this week. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. And a special thank you again to our guests Femi Nyader and Rob Lemkin. You can always catch our previous episodes and all our features online at theafricareport.com. If you enjoy this podcast, do rate and review us on your favorite platform. For the Africa Report, this is Anne-Marie Basada. Thanks for listening.